Good afternoon, everybody. As always, my name is JC, and welcome to my channel, Everyman's Thoughts. In today's video, I'm going to discuss my biggest concern for the adaptation, which is its relatively small budget, and what impact that could have on a series of this scale. Despite my concerns, I still have a very positive outlook for the show. In fact, I'll probably do that video next. However, this is something we should keep in mind as we look forward to the series premiere. Speaking of which, I will be covering the show for the entire life of the series. If that is of interest to you, please consider subscribing to my channel. And with that, let's get started. From public documents that were filed in Czechoslovakia, we know that the primary filming and production of the show cost about $75 million. Divide that by 8 episodes, and you're looking at a hair over $9 million per episode. Although this does represent the vast majority of the production cost for the show, it doesn't cover everything. If we factor in outside and ancillary costs like cast salary, we can form an educated conclusion that the show has a cost of about 10 to 13 million per episode. 10 on the low side, 13 on the high, probably somewhere in the middle. For context, the last season of Game of Thrones, which is 2-3 years ago now, that was 15 million per episode. Season 2 of The Witcher, 15 million. Loki, WandaVision, 25 million. And of course, we know Lord of the Rings is just off the charts. However, besides Lord of the Rings, these types of budgets are just not something Amazon does. Even their successful shows like The Man in High Castle or The Boys have a per episode budget of about $10 million. Many of their other shows have something near half of that. My concern here is, as people begin to do natural comparisons amongst the shows, Wheel of Time is simply going to be outgunned. It is entirely possible that the billion-dollar Lord of the Rings show will premiere just a few short months after Wheel of Time. That will likely not be a favorable comparison for us. Because of the raw numbers involved, you and I know that that's not a fair comparison, but life isn't fair and it is what it is. A more natural comparison might be to The Witcher. Season 1 of The Witcher had a $10 million per episode budget and started filming about a year before Wheel of Time. Season 2 of The Witcher has a $15 million budget and started filming about 6 months after Wheel of Time. As the Wheel of Time budget falls in between those two figures, I think we can say this is a more earnest comparison. The good news is Witcher Season 1 was wildly successful using a budget very similar to what we have. Of course, we could make an argument that those numbers were artificially inflated by the very popular video games and people being forced to stay in their homes, both of which are advantages that Wheel of Time will not have. However, those are arguments for another time, and I have different concerns. Despite all of its successes, The Witcher had two major criticisms. The first was its disjointed timeline, and the second was its visual presentation. The disjointed timeline had to do with unique elements within the Witcher story and not something that's relevant to this discussion. However, the poor visual presentation and not necessarily having the budget to do it right is staring us in the face. Everything from the cheap-looking armor to the CGI dragon and even the depiction of the dwarves were strongly criticized, and in my opinion, rightly so. To underscore how serious of an issue this was, everyone who had a significant role in the visual design of the show was replaced, and Netflix increased the budget by 50%. Set designer, replaced. Costume designer, replaced. Landscape decorator, replaced. CGI company, replaced. Furthermore, the world of The Witcher is a comparatively dreary place. So what happens when the Wheel of Time series, with a similar budget and similar budget constraints, has to portray a bigger, brighter world and places like Camelin and Tarvalin? Based on earlier interviews with showrunner Rafe Judkins, we know these budgetary concerns have already precluded things from being in the show. Specifically, we know the wardens won't have their multicolored cloaks because the CGI cost would be crippling. Also, magic weaving will only be shown when it's being viewed from the perspective of someone who can actually perceive the weaving, again cutting down on CGI costs. Now, this is perfectly reasonable. I mean, the cloaks don't really add anything to the story, so spending money there would be counterproductive. But what happens when it stops being the small stuff? What aspects of the story are we going to miss because this show doesn't have the budget like other shows do to build a set that they may only use once? For instance, what about Camelin? Camelin is described as this grand, ancient, beautiful city that may be second only to Tar Valon. For me, and I imagine most people, when a character enters a long abandoned ruin of a city of that grandeur, it becomes very intriguing. The dripping history and forgotten mysteries add a new level of immersion to the story. It reminds me of when Tyrion Lannister and Mormont were sailing through Valyria. You were contemplating, if not even romanticizing, the lost history of a completely fictional world. But we're likely not going to get that because you can't justify spending the money to build a set for Camelin when you may only use it once. I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think. Is 11, 12, maybe even $13 million enough? Or are we going to run into a lot of the same problems they had with Witcher Season 1? Well, that's it for me this week, guys. Please consider subscribing to my channel, and I will see you next time.